So I was like, okay, I'll put a congressional inquiry in because that's my last hope of anything happening. And so I look up the exact process to do it. I do it. I handwrite these letters. I send in my medical records to them. Like, this is what is wrong with me. I need help. I need to be held because I can't function. I can't hardly hold my daughter at night. I'm having panic attacks. I'm having moments of just like complete and utter despair. And no one's helping me.
Hello, this is Rob Conlon, and you're listening to the Oath We Took podcast, the show that tells the Marine Corps story through the Marines that served. Today is a bonus episode, and I'm joined by Tab Bartley. She is the reason for this podcast. There are so many amazing Marines who hesitate to tell their stories. Their stories hold so much power and so many life lessons, but oftentimes they go untold. Not every Marine's story is the same, but what is the same is the oath they all took. Today, I've taken over hosting duties to allow Tab to share a piece of her story and why she started this podcast. We'll talk about women's health, her time in the Marine Corps, and the challenges of transitioning out of military culture. Tab, I am absolutely humbled to be hosting this show with you today. It is kind of, as you said before we got on the recording here, a full circle moment here to be hosting this for you. Of course, I call your podcast one of my own podcasts, Children, which is a very fun thing. So I would say welcome to the show, but you already know what it's like to be here.
Well, thank you so much for taking it over and doing this. I am honored, and it, like you said, it is just so full circle to everything.
Definitely. And it is such a pleasant thing to see this show have been such a success from the get-go. I work in the podcast industry, and I know that half of all podcasts don't make it past episode 7. So to see you do episode 8 and then moving on from that, I was like, oh yes, this thing that we've talked about for years, and having met you during the pandemic and things like that has really fully come kind of full circle as something that is really taking wings, which is outstanding. So we'll transition here a little bit into our main conversation today. And I guess, Tab, this is something that, you and I have talked many times before, and I don't think I ever got this out of you in our time of why did you decide to go join the Marine Corps?
Yeah. And it's funny because I feel like I talk about it all the time, but then that happens all the time where people then ask me, well, why did you join? And for me, I never had any aspirations. I didn't know anything about the Marine Corps, really. A recruiter called me one day. I was going to community college, and he was like, you want to come in and talk? And I was like, well, sure. He caught me on a good day, but there's like no way I'm joining the Marine Corps. I just guess I had nothing else to do that day. And I went into the recruiting station, and he started talking about the New York Yankees, Bernie Williams era, which was my favorite era of baseball. I'm a huge Yankee fan. He was from New York City. And so we started talking about that. And then conversations led to others. And then he brought up the public affairs job, MOS, in the Marine Corps.
Okay.
And I was like, well, what's that? And he's like, it's journalism, it's public speaking, it's media relations. It's literally all of these things. And I was like, do that in the Marine Corps? Like, what? Like, how much school do you have to go? Like, tell me more. And as he told me about that job, I got really, really interested. And I was like, like thinking in my mind, but like still poker face, and I'm not joining the Marine Corps. And then he tells me about this story. And I, to this day, have no idea if it's a true story or not, but it doesn't matter. Okay. It's one of those stories.
Okay.
And he was like, I have to tell you about this uniform that we wear and what it means. And he was talking about how one of the deployments he was on was a humanitarian mission. And all of these other branches of service had tried to get provisions to some people, and they weren't able to, because every time they went past a certain line, they got shot at. And the goal was a humanitarian mission, was not for us to shoot.
Sure.
And so they called in his unit of Marines, and they were able to get these provisions to these people and essentially rescue these people, because what the uniform stands for and what it means to people, they knew that they didn't want to shoot at Marines because they knew what the consequences would potentially be, and just what it meant to be a Marine. And let me tell you, that got me. I was just like, I at that point in my life, I was going to school for social work, and I
Mhm.
wanted to see the worst in people because I believe that's when you would also see the best in people. And so when he told me that, I was like, this is a random phone call. It happened for a reason, which is such a theme to my story and my life in general. And it was just like all of these things wouldn't have brought me here to this moment to learn this if I wasn't supposed to do it. And so I enlisted into the Marine Corps.
And there we have it. Now, I think there's a couple things to unpack there. Number one, now you mentioned big into baseball and things like that. Is telling this journalism story? I feel like journalism in New York are like tied together. Like you almost hear those people, and the Yankees are up on the mound. The kind of that old timey radio journalism thing. I don't. Maybe that's a fabricated kind of like, oh, this girl's interested in journalism. Let's play that big city New York baseball. Yeah, here's the pitch kind of thing. But the other side of that too is I love that you transfer that kind of story into what the Marine Corps uniform means. As you were telling that, in the back of my mind, I'm going, the only reason the Marines got that through is because, and I mean this in the nicest way, they're the people you don't want to like the bad people know that you will out hurt them basically if they decide to come at you.
And then to do that, but to know that like he's doing it for a humanitarian mission and that there was this flip side, right? That it didn't always result in that, right?
Right.
Like that could result in something so positive. It was just like that spoke to me because as corny as this is, I absolutely love Boy Meets World and Mr. Feeney's, last message of do good.
Yes.
That's like what I live by. I don't want to do great things. I don't want to do amazing things. I just want to do some good.
And I think that's actually one of the biggest things that a lot of our armed forces do. We do see in the news, oh my goodness, something went wrong with a training exercise or some combat action or whatever it might be around the world. But honest to goodness, the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Coast Guard, Army, Air Force, they're probably some of the greatest forces for good in the known world. It's really interesting to see that because again, I feel like we only see like when you are such a high up thing in the world, it's really easy to take pot shots at that and bring that down. Oh, you're not perfect, haha. But yeah, so you joined the service, spent how long there?
So I served 8 years in the Marine Corps,
8 years.
and funny enough, I had to wait 5 months to enlist, and then was in the delayed entry program for 11 months, and you
Oh,
can only be in that for 12 months because I wanted public affairs. Like I was set on getting that job and that MOS. And so my first duty station was Marine Corps Base Quantico, and my second duty station was Marine Corps Recruiting Station Columbia.
got it. So then you have this position in journalism. How was your time doing 8 years of this, where basically Uncle Sam signs your paycheck, number one, but kind of owns you as far as a journalist, number two?
It was For me, it was a very cool experience. So all of us in all the armed services go to the Defense Information School, which
Hmm.
is just an amazing school and institute. And the way that you're trained in the military, it worked so much better for me than just sitting in a classroom because it was so hands-on. It was so just like super active. And my first duty station, and I feel really old now. I worked for the last newspaper of the Marine Corps. It no longer exists. And we, at that time, were one of very few. And so we were pushing out 10 to 12 stories a week for a newspaper. And it was just such a cool experience. And that was right when like social media was starting up. So
Sure.
we were pushing out social media and content doing that. And so I got to cover a lot of really cool things. But when I first got there, I saw a position called community relations, which managed all of the volunteer programs. And I was like, that's going to be my job. I'm going to do that. And funny enough, I ended up doing that before I left Quantico. And that was one of the most impactful positions in the Marine Corps for me. I had the honor of doing the honor flights. And one of the honor
Oh,
flights, I got to be my grandfather's guardian.
that
Um,
is magical. That is absolutely magical.
yeah,
How was it?
he didn't talk about his time in the army
Interesting.
until after that. And there was a moment in it where we were sitting on the bus and he just like reached out and held my hand. And he was like, I don't know why I made it when everybody else didn't. And it was just like, I had nothing to say to him, but he didn't want me to say anything. It was like in that moment, I realized he wanted to be able to talk about it and have somebody listen. And that really, really stuck with me. Like, I don't always have to have something to say. Sometimes in those moments, especially of like that trauma and those tragedies and all of those emotions, sometimes all you need is somebody to listen to you.
Right. Silence is a sound sometimes. Silence is a tool, and something I know about, not only in my day job, which is making podcasts for people, but having that pause, having that moment with him, I'm sure, as he's listening to himself, but also listening to how you're reacting, even if it's just like breathing sometimes, of because we convey emotions in other ways, you even during that my eyes started to water a little bit and things like that. So I think that's absolutely magical. I think Honor Flight is one of the most amazing things. My wife's boss happens to be connected very locally here where I live with our local Honor Flight chapter, and my adoptive grandfather had his as well, and I was the backup to go on that. So I missed out, but he got to go with his son, which was pretty great. So I'm
Hey.
so glad that you had a tremendous time with that. I guess the one thing I want to go back to though that I didn't get to ask you before you told that wonderful aside about your grandfather is why community relations? What drove you to that like subsector of journalism?
So at Quantico, they they got to, at that time it was a whole office, and they got to interact a lot more with the local community. There was all of the volunteering we did was outside of base. It was at the local SPCA center. It was at the local elementary schools and middle schools and just different community events. And I absolutely loved seeing that integration and seeing people's perceptions kind of challenged of what it means to be a Marine and what it means
Oh,
to serve, and those interactions. And Quantico is a huge military community, so it wasn't as like, there weren't as many perceptions being challenged because a lot of these people here are used to it. But it was really cool to see that interaction, and to see like kids especially interacting with Marines. And it was just something I wanted to be a part of. And it was a leadership position. It was a lot more leading and a lot more
oh,
managing and getting people of way higher ranking to do things and running events, and still getting to take photos, still getting to write, but not at the same capacity, not where
sure.
that's everything. I'm a very much a people person. And so it was a lot more people-y.
Gotcha. So forgive the pun here, but maybe a little bit less grunt work in this case to get some of that leadership and bring that part of growth into yourself. That's awesome. I really like that. Uh, I guess when you're in this 8-year span, what was your favorite thing about spending time doing this big development and interacting with these communities?
So my second duty station was Marine Corps Recruiting Station Columbia, and I managed all of South Carolina minus the Beaufort area, and then up into like the Asheville, North Carolina area, and a piece of Georgia. And
It's a lot of
I
geography.
it's a huge,
Yeah,
huge
that's a
location.
large area. Wow.
Yeah, I had a nice for a while, a nice H3 that was all branded, and then just a red F-150, which wasn't as cool. But
Right.
I would travel all
Did
around
it at
the
least say Marines
state.
on the side?
It did. It had
Okay, good.
branding, but it was just the F-150.
That's why I like my tax dollars buying.
Hey, but it worked. But so I would get to travel to all of these schools and interact, and there were two moments or two things that I looked forward to every year. One was the Marine Corps Educators Workshop,
Cool.
which I brought educators on who had actually went with me in an earlier episode of the podcast. But that week spent at Paris Island with them was like, it was life-changing for me too, because again, like going back to seeing the people's perceptions challenged and the conversations we were able to have, it was raw and it was real, and there was nothing off the table as far as like what we're discussing. And I think that's really important. And then I had the opportunity to help create the first volleyball leadership academy that the Marine Corps ever did. And it brought my two loves together of volleyball and the Marine Corps. And it was something that my command believed in me. And when I was like, I think this is something that'll work, they were like, all right, we have your back and we'll put the money into it. And so we were the first ones to do it. And now it's done across the East Coast. And so
Interesting.
that was something that was very unique into my rank and position that I don't think anybody else would have even had the opportunity, even if they wanted to. But I had leadership that was utterly amazing and just let me do my job and believed that I could do it. And that was really impactful.
Sure. The question I have to ask here about that program that you just described, how do the Marine Corps and volleyball interact?
Amazing.
Well,
So
sounds like it, but like what's the connection there that drives that relationship?
leadership. We were teaching them leadership. So we were there teaching them our leadership principles and how to lead. And they would go through drills. We would pull in actual volleyball coaches. None of the other Marines taught besides me. Um, but we pulled in volleyball coaches from the area. And then this was open to all high schoolers, men and women. And they would come in and we would teach different leadership traits and how to lead in different scenarios and have different conversations of how do you bring these leadership skills and implement it on the court and then just in your everyday life. And that's one thing I will say about the Marine Corps. I think the Marine Corps has the best leaders and makes the best leaders out there, hands down. When you can look up the leadership traits and the leadership principles, and there are so many amazing tools and things to utilize to become a Marine Corps. And that's something the Marine Corps has done very well because we're such a smaller branch of service that we're leading at a way lower ranks and we're having more responsibilities than the other branches of service way sooner. And so that's something, at least my recruiting station and Marine Corps recruiting in general tries to provide to their community is, we don't need you all to join the Marine Corps, but here's something we can give you. Here's some leadership and here's some take back.
That's really wonderful. Again, and the fact that it's open to everybody so that even folks who don't decide that the Marine Corps is the right path for them have something that they can take away and say, hey, man, those Marine folks are really quite fantastic. They taught me all this amazing stuff. And of course, it's, forget another pun here, kind of battle tested, if you will, as well, which is outstanding. So thanks for drawing that line there for me, especially with such a unique program. Again, volleyball would not be the vector I thought would go. But again, I suppose when you have a small unit under your command in a certain position on a field, whether it's a battlefield or a volleyball court, you probably there's probably quite a few parallels there, which is great. Okay, so volleyball, fantastic time running, the last Marine Corps newspaper, all of these things, connecting with communities across your career in the Corps. It's time to pack it out. What and or rather why, rephrase that. Why did you transition out of the Marine Corps?
Sadly, it wasn't really a choice that I had made. My body gave out, and I had 3 beautiful children when I was in the Marine Corps. And shortly after having her, when you have a kid, you get your initial like 6 weeks from your OBGYN that, hey, you're good to go. The issue being for us is 9 times out of 10, that's a civilian who has no experience in the military or the Marine Corps. And so my OBGYN said, you're good to go. 6 weeks. At that time, I think my maternity leave was like 6 or 8 weeks. I don't really remember because I went through so many different spans. And I got a call. It was literally like I was off of maternity leave that day. And I got a call. It was a Saturday from RXO saying, hey, can you cover this event? The Wrecking Raiders is doing a hike. It'll be 8 miles through Columbia, and our police and our recruiting substation is going to be there. Can you join and take photos? Heck yes, I can. Like that's what I live for, right? Like that's what I love to do. And so I grabbed my pack.
I can hear the oorah out of your mouth.
Yeah.
Like, oorah, let's go.
And so I take my camera gear and I go there, and it's like middle of the night, like 10 p.m. at night. And I drive to the starting point, and like at that point, I know I'm not in shape right now. Like I'm not in shape. So I knew I wasn't going to do the whole 8 miles.
You've just had a baby. Come on.
Exactly. And I knew I wasn't, but I was like, okay, I'll start with them and then I'll drive to the finish because that'll be fine. Right. And
Sure.
so I started taking photos, and they're hiking, but they're hiking at a pretty fast pace. So I'm obviously having to run and back and run and back and take photos, and it's super dark. So it's really hard for me to get the photos. They're on, streets with hardly any lights. So I'm out there a lot longer than I thought I was going to be. And I hop in the car, drive to the next location, and um the night ends. I'm in severe pain. I've had multiple hip surgeries before this though, so I thought it was just my hips, I'm out of shape, like all of these things. Still breastfeeding, like I'm not surprised. I'm having a rough time. I get home and go to sleep, in pain, and then I wake up the next day and I am in the worst pain of my life. I had natural births, and this pain, I can't even describe how bad it was. It wasn't even comparable to childbirth.
So
Million
that's like a
times.
17 on a scale of 1 to 10, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I started feeling something strange. Call the nurses line. They're like, "Oh, we have no idea what it could be. We have no idea." And I'm like, "I feel like I'm dying. Like I don't know how else to explain this. Like what could be happening to me?" And the nurse couldn't give me an answer. So we go to the emergency room. And long story short, it ends up that my uterus and my bladder and my rectum are all falling out of my body, which is called an organ prolapse. And the Marine Corps is the Marine Corps doesn't have medical, and it's really hard to get any sort of like specialty care. And so it took weeks of me going from like to get back to my OB to confirm like, yes, that's what it was, to then be sent to a specialist. And at this point, um, I had orders for Okinawa, and not knowing what medically was going on with me, I essentially, it's called like denying the orders, and was like, I'm not going to Okinawa. I don't know what's going to happen to me. They can't even get it figured out, and I'm stateside. Like, what would happen to me if I went somewhere else? And so it's months of this, and trying to fight and figure out like, A, what exactly is wrong with me, B, like what even could be the solution to it. And as this is all happening, I'm still working. I'm the only one that does my job. Nobody else in the recruiting station does my job. I am having severe pain. I can't stand for more than 15 minutes. It's causing migraines and anxiety and just all of these things. And I really start to spiral. And in that, it's like, well, if you deny orders, you're going to have to get out of the Marine Corps now. And it's like, okay, but I need to try and get on a med board so that I can medically be held, so the Marine Corps can fix me, right? Like
Right.
that's what should happen if you get injured while you're in. And it all just starts spiraling, and time keeps going, and I'm trying to advocate for myself, yet I'm not dropping my pack. So I'm still working full time and putting myself through more physically than I even should have. And it comes to the point where I'm a week from my EAS, which is like your end of service when you'd be out of
Mhm.
the Marine Corps, and they're finally doing my eval. And the doctor who's evaluating me, who's supposed to determine like, okay, we're going to sign off on this package so you can go on a med board, so we can medically hold you, extend your time in so we can fix you, decides that my issues aren't life or death. And so the VA can fix me. And that was the exact quote from the doctor. And at that point, I'm a week from my EAS. I just, I just, I just broke down. I was just like, no one is fighting for me. I've done all of these things for the Marine Corps, and I'm here alone. And there's nothing my husband can do. And so, um, I'm the person that always finds the answer. Like that's the thing. I don't have any of the answers, but always
Mhm.
find the answers or find the path. And so I was like, okay, I'll put a congressional inquiry in, because that's my last hope of anything happening. And so I look up the exact process to do it. I do it. I handwrite these letters. I send in my medical records to them. Like, this is what is wrong with me. I need help. I need to be held, because I can't function. I can't hardly hold my daughter at night. I'm having panic attacks. I'm having moments of just like complete and utter despair. And no one's helping me. I need a congressional inquiry done to
Mhm.
see what can be done. And nothing. I get an intern's response, which
Oh.
is like nothing. And all of these other things. And it's just like, okay, well, I need to move back to Indiana. I have to get my family back to Indiana, and I have to find a job because while all this is happening, my husband got out of the Navy a few years ago, and he decided to stay home with our kids so that I could stay in the Marine Corps.
Right.
And so the pressure of all of that, and then what I was causing on my family, was just like, okay, I guess this path isn't going to work, and I'm just going to have to chuck it up and figure it out. And so that was my transition, or the start of the transition, out of the Marine Corps.
Well, it's one wild start, especially, when you think of people leaving the Marine Corps, it's, oh, you've been honorably discharged, things are just fine. You've done your tours, things like that. Or, maybe you are medically discharged because in the course of those tours, something happened to you, you took around, or you lost something to an IED or whatever it might be. But I think, and this is one of my most favorite things about you, Tab, is that you've taught me so much that people who serve our country, there are, obviously we know that there's always the mental toll, but there's also a lot of people, what is it, 10% of participants in the armed forces are boots on the ground, but 90% of everything else is logistics and transport and all of these other things that make the US military go. And people get hurt and have life derailments, if you will, in the course of that as well. And I think that the population that you're a member of is probably one of the most underrepresented in the military sphere, if you will. And I think that it's just wonderful that you're telling this story so far. And I want to thank you. Thank you so much for your vulnerability, with, not just myself, but with our listener here, who is learning that, you are giving your all through this time of transitioning out, even though, before this injury happened, you weren't transitioning out, but you were giving your all, and you gave it until your body broke. And that's, I cannot imagine, you mentioned three distinct things that are falling out of you. And it's like, that's a problem. And I don't want to make light of that in any way, shape, or form, but like, that is a, oh shit moment, for anybody in this case. Plus, I just think that the tower of responsibilities that you had stacked on yourself there is incredibly laudable as well, with being a mom 3 times over, holding down the breadwinning job for the family, and as you said, not dropping your pack in that case. So I think that's outstanding. So your transition outward, we've gotten to kind of the point where it's critical that you leave. In my past, I had a time where I left an organization that had an incredibly strong culture, and this is actually something I've been meaning to look into and study a bit myself. Is that some organizations, military in particular, and other ones that sort of touch that a little bit, have incredibly strong cultures. When you remove yourself from them, whether it's voluntarily or not, it sort of takes a piece of you with it. With your body falling apart on you, and this gigantic part of your life of being a Marine, of being a part of this culture that has been going on for, if my calendar is correct, 237 years now. That's a really strong thing. How did you begin to manage that transition from the Marine Corps back to civilian life in Indiana?
At first, I didn't. I mean, that was part of the struggle. I have an amazing support system, and I did there, and that was our reason for moving back to Indiana. But it was such a struggle, and like what you said about, I felt like not so much that I lost a piece of myself, but that the Marine Corps allowed me to be my authentic self, and I didn't think that the civilian sector could handle that. I didn't think that they could handle Blunt Bartley. I didn't think that I could have my personality and do it in the civilian sector. It just didn't, I didn't think it was going to work. And what I had done in the Marine Corps didn't seem to matter in the civilian sector. Although I had done this job for 8 years and been amazing at the job, I didn't have a degree. So it didn't equal the same pay. It didn't equal the experience. My experience just didn't matter as much. And that was something that was extremely hard for me, because literally that Saturday before I got out of the Marine Corps, I was still working. I was still covering because
Mhm.
it was my program and it was, what I had done. And so as I'm fighting to find a place and find a job, I was lucky enough to land a position with the Purdue Research Foundation, which is the fundraisers at Purdue
Of
University.
course, yes.
And it was an admin job and sort of entry level, sort of not. And at first it kind of like it broke my heart a little bit because it was like this is all I can equate to. 8 years of doing a job and all I can equate to is an entry level position. And that was one of the best things that happened to me. The team that I was blessed to work with and the university and just the interactions and the people I made. And I had 2 cousins who worked on Purdue University, and being able to walk at lunch with them and talk to them, because at a time I wasn't talking about what I was going through, and the few times I brought up like my disabilities, it was like taboo and other people felt uncomfortable. And that was so strange to me because in the Marine Corps, like you talk about everything medical, like because it affects everybody. And I had previously had hip surgeries and had talked about this, but uh, organ prolapses is something that was just like, that's a woman's issue. I don't want to hear it, or I'm uncomfortable because it's a woman's issue, or this and that. And so getting that job in that position was honestly like part of the reason why I feel like I did actually start to transition. And in that transition though, I as I'm fighting to get care, because I had to fight the VA to get care and
Right.
had to fight to get that care. I did understand though how I don't like to say that I was suicidal, but I understood how in the transition somebody could get to that point. Um just so fully, and it was for me it was so many different things. Of at one point I was just sick of having to fight. I was sick of having to fight. But it it was it was so much more than even just that. I had this amazing family and this amazing support system, and my husband and my children had to bear the weight of it, or I felt like they did. And so there was just a time that it was like, would it be better if they didn't have to see me going through this? Would it have been better for them if my husband didn't have to bear all the weight of literally everything, because I can't do it. I can't make dinner. I can't play with my kids because of the severity of like the pain and everything that was going on for me. There was a really, really dark time where I thought it would be better for them if I wasn't around and they didn't have to deal with me. And luckily, like my belief system and their support, I could never actually do that. But I really understood how it could get to that point. And funny enough, our mutual friend, Chris Zahn, one of the days that I had kind of like just felt like that was it, I had posted on, I think it was Facebook, a rant, which I normally don't do. And it was just like, I'm so sick of all the like, whatever. I deleted it within like 5 minutes because I was like, I can't post something like this. And then
Right.
he calls me immediately. I probably haven't talked to him and I don't know how long. And he calls me immediately and he's like, what is going on? Just tell me what is going on. And we talked, and I went back in the office, and it wasn't that anything monumental was said. I mean, it sure was, because Chris, he's good at saying like
Right.
great
Of
things.
course, yes.
But it was the fact that I had this moment where this whole time I have been asking for help. And it was like in that moment, like somebody responded, even though it wasn't like to fix things, but it was just like, you're not alone. And even though I knew I wasn't alone and there were all these other people doing things, it was just to call out into the void and then to get an instant response. It really helped me. And for me, and after processing that, I was like, I can't let anybody go through what I went through, because I had all the support and all of these things. And I was like, I have to do something. I have to do something more, whether it's I start talking about what I went through, or what. And it, weirdly enough, I started sharing my story on LinkedIn, and then I started
Mhm.
connecting with people and being on podcasts and sharing my story. And that led to creating a group for women veterans. And then it led to me running for state senate, which anybody who knows me and is listening to this knows that I'm the last person you would ever expect to run for a political office.
Maybe that's what we need a little bit more of in this country, but no, I'm so glad that when you mentioned that you were kind of at that low point, that very deepest moment of maybe the world would be better off without me, which is something, you know, I've in my life I've faced as well. I'm not trying to step on your parade here at all, but I think for you that when you're in that moment, when you reached out, the fact that, you know, into the darkness and somebody reached back, I think that that was incredible. But the fact that it was a Marine that reached back, I think is a very amazing thing to take home from that tale you just told. So as we bring our time here somewhat to a close, there's a few more questions I have to ask you. I did want to ask this because of the ordeal that you had transitioning out, how it impacted your family, how it impacted you, how it impacted, I'm sure your husband, like this poor guy, like my spouse is in tremendous pain, the kids are hungry, I have to be at work doing things, I'm one pillar here. Did the Marine Corps let you down a little bit when it came to your health care as a woman?
They did, honestly. And it was something that I think that was part of it for me, that it was so hard to admit. Um, and I think I was so proud to be a Marine, and it felt like I lost that, right? And when I was in the Marine Corps, I didn't get the name Blunt Bartley because I was nice about things in the Marine Corps. I got the name Blunt Bartley because when things were messed up or weren't right, I was all about saying, well, this needs fixed or this needs changed, right?
Call
Because
it out. Yeah.
when you love something, you want it to be better. And it
Yes.
felt like when I got out that I almost couldn't do that anymore because I wasn't in. And then it was hard to be my own voice against the Marine Corps too. But as I got out and I met more and more female Marines who experienced the same physical ailments I had, I realized that this was a trend, and it is a trend on multiple generations of females in the Marine Corps. And so the Marine Corps is failing, and they do need to do better. And there's a lot of initiatives that need to happen and should happen and could happen, as simple as postpartum care of a doula. That could have changed everything for me. I could have potentially known that it was happening and known that I needed to take whatever precautions. I'm now seen for it. I will be in pelvic floor physical therapy probably for the rest of my life unless I decide to get surgery. It's not like this thing goes away. It's not like it's not something you can just fix. It's gonna have an impact on me for the rest of my life. And for the Marine Corps to be so nonchalant of it's not life or death and the VA can fix you, it's not the right mindset. And we need to prevent this from happening. And there's a lot of steps that the Marine Corps could take and should take. And then personally, I shouldn't have been fighting that battle alone. I had a command that should have been fighting for me and making sure I got the medical needs I should have gotten.
Interesting. So Tab, I want to press a little bit more on that if you'll let me. How else can the Marine Corps better support postpartum and pregnant service members?
Yeah, I think one of the easiest things, and especially with doulas having just been approved by TRICARE, we need to extend the doulas services to postpartum care. We also need to implement in the Marine Corps better training physically. You have to think, when female Marines are pregnant, 9 times out of 10, they're nowhere near their support system. They're not by their mom. They're not by their aunts. Even if they were, their aunts and moms probably weren't as physically active as female Marines need to be. And so that means we need to take a specific look at postpartum. What do we need to do to prepare the body to be able to do pull-ups, to be able to run 3 miles, to do all the physical things we have to do? There does need to be separate physical training and teaching around that, because you're in an island 9 times out of 10. Who's going to tell you what's happening in your body or what could happen or how to prevent it? And it's the Marine Corps' due diligence to make sure that female Marines know what's going on in that time in their lives. It's no different than preparing somebody who's overweight to how to properly make weight, or how to, if you can't run the 3 miles, how do you get physically fit enough to run the 3 miles? If you can't do pull-ups, all of these things are taught and it's part of the Marine Corps. Well, it should be the same when somebody is going through postpartum.
Interesting. And as you mentioned, like doing pull-ups, I'm like, yeah, that is a full body thing. And when you have a child, a lot of those core muscles that are probably very essential. I'm not a kinesiologist or anything like that, but like a lot of those muscles are probably either out of sorts, number one, or damaged in some way or another. So yeah, I think that the rehabilitatory training is probably something that a branch of the service should really look at. Marines, Army, Navy, everybody, which is outstanding. So I guess the last question I have sort of based around this tab is when you got out of the Marine Corps, you're going through this entire process and you finally come to the realization that, you know what, I'm not alone. You run for state office and things like that. How long did it take you to feel, I guess, yourself again, whole again from getting out of the Marine Corps?
Honestly, I still struggle. I'm still going to therapy, and that was October of 2018. And there's still days that I do feel alone, but I'm not sure the transition will ever fully end. I think it's just different transitions, and I think realizing that has been healing, that the transition continues. But it has improved so much because I've found a community and I've found my voice and I've found that my story matters. And in me telling my story, it's led to so many things that I realized that part of the other thing I missed in the Marine Corps was telling other people's stories and being able to. And we talked earlier full circle, and that's where it comes with the podcast. I saw it as an opportunity for me to be able to share other people's stories as well, and the hope that they'll realize how much their story matters and how much they matter. And it's not about, you don't need to be the first female Marine to do anything or the first Marine to do all these things, like, right? It's not about being great, it's being good. And I just believe that we are, and our stories matter. And the more we tell our stories, the more we realize that there's connections, like not only with other Marines and other veterans, but even in our own community.
Well, you certainly have a knack for bringing things full circle, my friend. Not only even this podcast episode, you've done the very same thing. Well, that is leaving us with our last question here, Tab, which is, if you had to take the oath again, would you?
I would. I would in a heartbeat. I feel like I was meant to be in the Marine Corps. But the one thing I would have done is I would have dropped my pack sooner, and I would have made myself and my family a priority sooner, because something that was told to me is the Marine Corps can and will always replace you, and they will. But it's the Marines to the left and the right who can't. And at the time when I was told that, I took it very personal. I was like, oh, what do you mean? You mean like I have no value in the Marine Corps? And looking back on it now on the other end, that's not what the Marine was saying. They were saying at some point you have to think about yourself first again, and not put the Marine Corps first.
That's some pretty wise advice. Outstanding. We have a saying in my industry of, when you're ending a podcast, leave people with a moment. And I'm certain that you've done that with us today. This is the Oath We Took podcast. You just heard a piece of Tab's story. You now know one more Marine and one more piece of the Marine Corps history. Her service matters. Her stories matter. Not every Marine's story is the same. They didn't all join the military for the same reason. But what is the same is the oath they all took. An oath that could easily have ended in death. And for some, it did. So listener, instead of asking you to thank a Marine for their service, I'm going to challenge you to continue to listen to their stories instead.